security guarantees from Moscow? Absolutely not, because Lavrov was clear last week that the way Russia sees those security guarantees is that it's all in the hands of the UN Security Council, where Russia and China would have a veto, and the NATO countries would not be able to implement any provisions on the ground. No NATO troops on the ground. It would be paper guarantees. It would be back to the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which you recall guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty at the time, and which Russia has torn up on at least two occasions in 2014 and 2022. So no, that's not a security guarantee that anybody would have any particular faith in, given particularly Putin's behavior as a serial violator of written agreements. I mean, there's an American research institute that calculates that Russia has violated over 130 international agreements since invading Ukraine. And we learned this week that the Russian Prime Minister is now recommending that Moscow also withdraw from the International Convention Against Torture and so on. So no, Russia cannot be involved in the definition of these security guarantees. That is something which Ukraine and its Western allies have to agree among themselves. Of course, the other part about NATO membership, which my old boss at NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, mentioned, is that this is also something for NATO to decide and Ukraine. It's the right of every country in Europe under international law to join an alliance if that country so wishes. And that is a principle, by the way, that Russia also agreed to back in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe after the end of the Cold War. And if NATO gives Russia a veto over NATO policy and NATO decisions, that means that NATO is no longer NATO. NATO loses its freedom of maneuver and sovereignty. And if Russia questions the legitimacy of NATO enlargement to Ukraine, it questions the legitimacy of all of the enlargements to Central and Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, etc., which NATO has carried out since 1999. So this would not only be bad for Ukraine, it would be bad for the Central and Eastern Europeans, because then you would see a Russian campaign already started to try to push NATO forces out of the territory of those former communist states in Central and Eastern Europe as well. So this would be bad for Ukraine, but also very, very, very bad for the credibility of NATO.
If Moscow is deliberately delaying negotiations, as we see now, what combination of military and non-military tools could Ukraine use in coming years to shift Russia's calculations? It could be deep strikes, energy infrastructure, naval operations, border pressure. What should take a priority?
Well, the key thing is to help Ukraine to do the things that Ukraine does well already, to build on its strengths. And then, of course, in a longer term, to try to remedy some of the weaknesses. I mean, you're right. At the moment, the strength of Ukraine are these long-range strikes against the Russian oil energy facilities. I mean, for example, gasoline prices in Moscow today or in St. Petersburg are much higher because 17% of the Russian refinery capacity has been taken out of operation through these Ukrainian drone strikes. So that is having an effect, and that pressure has to be maintained to make it harder for Russia to finance and to sustain the war. The second thing, of course, is Ukraine has had a great deal of success with these sabotage operations and intelligence operations deep inside Russia, destroying, for example, strategic bombers on Russian airfields far away as Siberia. The third thing is to help Ukraine with its drone production, of course, particularly long-range drones, the development of the long-range cruise missile that President Zelensky, the Flamengo, unveiled this week, to move defense production to Ukraine itself, as German companies, Danish companies, Norwegian companies, and some American companies are doing as well, because that's quicker and cheaper than supplying weapons from Western stocks too. Counter-drone technology, particularly against the fiber optic drones that Russia is using at the moment. And also NATO is now doing a lot of work with Ukraine on technologies to shoot down the Russian glide bombs, which are devastating against civilian targets. Further afield, more air defense systems. So it's good that this week we've had indications from Germany, from Norway, about more Patriot air defense systems being sent to Ukraine, ammunition to make sure that the Ukrainians defending in the Donbass are able to maintain a heavy rate of fire against Russian advances, to stop further Russian advances. And then, of course, Sofia, in the long run, naturally, more pressure on Moscow through economic sanctions. It would be good if the US Congress could approve an authority to the president to impose sanctions on Russia, so that Trump has all of the legal instruments in place, should he decide, as I hope he will, to impose those greater oil and financial sanctions against Moscow. So there's a lot to be done. Of course, the weakness is the Ukrainian manpower problem, the retention of manpower to stop the desertion rate in the Ukrainian army. That can't be remedied overnight, but that's where at least technology can help to compensate for manpower deficiencies until the recruitment and training issue in the Ukrainian army can be remedied.
If the war turns into a prolonged frozen conflict, what would this mean for Europe's political architecture? I'm talking about both the EU and NATO. Could this basically repeat historical patterns like those seen in Czechoslovakia in the last century?
Well, I'm an academic historian by training, and if I look at Czechoslovakia, the Munich conference in September 1938, the big mistake that the French and the British made at the time was believing in the words of Hitler. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, came back to the UK with a piece of paper with Hitler's signature and proclaimed, "Peace in our time." 6 months later, in March 1939, Hitler had occupied all of the Czechoslovakia in defiance of the Munich Agreement. And of course, then he went on to invade Poland on the 1st of September 1939. So no, first conclusion is don't conclude paper agreements with dictators and believe that their signature has any weight. The second thing, Sofia, with the frozen conflicts, the Minsk processes, the Normandy processes with Ukraine, with Georgia, with Azerbaijan, Armenia, with Moldova, they were basically trusted negotiations that went nowhere. And of course, the lesson I think that NATO has learned, and NATO leaders have acknowledged this, after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, was to carry on negotiating and not simultaneously arm Ukraine. If we had given Ukraine after 2014 the training, the weapons, the assistance, the political support that we gave them after 2022, the second Russian invasion, probably Putin would not have invaded Ukraine. The Ukrainian army would have simply been too strong. So if, yes, we have to accept another sort of frozen conflict situation in eastern Ukraine, which at least stops the war and stops the killing, it has to go alongside this massive rearmament, retraining program. In other words, whether there's a peace agreement or not with Russia, NATO has to be involved in the training, equipment and arming of the Ukrainian army to deter further Russian land grabs, at least freeze the situation until some meaningful peace formula, hopefully with a post-Putin Russia, can take place.
How vulnerable would Central and Eastern Europe become in this scenario of a frozen war? Does it increase the risk of renewed aggression against not only Ukraine, but neighboring states?
Well, that's a great question. And I think, obviously, if when the war ends, whatever the political outcome, the Russian army will, of course, have taken a beating. The Ukrainians have inflicted a severe beating on the Russian army, over 1 million dead and casualties, massive thousands of tanks, armored vehicles destroyed. Obviously, the Russian war industry has been hit, as we were talking about earlier. So I don't think Russia is going to be in a situation where it would be able to immediately sort of carry on, even if it were successful in Ukraine, to attack a NATO country. It would need time to sort of rebuild, to reconstitute, to reform. So NATO, I think, would continue to enjoy some kind of breathing space. For how long, we don't know, 5 years, 10 years, nobody really knows, to build up its own forces, of course. But there's no doubt that Russian troops on the border between Ukraine and the West, not at the moment only in the east, that would be a very worrying, alarming scenario for NATO, which would obviously push defense spending and NATO's own military build-up even higher. It can't be, peace under those terms can't be good news. Putin would be encouraged to believe that aggression wins. But I think in the short run, what we would see would be a continuation of this Russian attempt to divide the West, woo the United States, split the EU, split NATO, carry on, all of these hybrid warfare attacks. In recent days, we've seen a Russian cyber attack against a dam in Norway. Finland has put on trial Russians involved in cutting telecommunications cables in the Baltic Sea. We've seen Russian sabotage attempts in the Baltic states, in Poland, in the UK. Lots and lots of activities to try to really play on our own political divisions, to soften us up, if you like, for an ultimate Russian military aggression. And that's, I think, it's happening already. But I think in the wake of the end of the Ukrainian war, Russia will certainly try to sort of accelerate those kind of operations, which are still, as far as Russia are concerned, cheap. We're a target-rich environment, unfortunately, and we don't respond as vigorously to those sort of attacks as we would respond against a full-scale Russian military invasion.
Thank you. Thank you for this conversation and for your interesting insights.
As always, a pleasure. And again, all the best for Ukraine, and keep the resistance going. Thank you for the opportunity.
If you like this video, please subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments.